London, late 1970s. A gray morning, a river moving like a thought that knows better than to speak. In a brick building where the hallways smell faintly of paper and patience, a file travels from one pair of hands to another. The cover name is tidy, the contents are not. Inside is a man who works for the KGB and has been telling London what he sees. He is careful. He is exact. He is already older than his years, which is what happens when you carry two loyalties in the same chest and try to keep them from scraping. NHI's name is Oleg Gordievsky. He was not recruited with cash in a car park or caught in a camera flash beside a stranger he shouldn't have known. He arrived at this line in small steps. Education inside a system that taught certainty. Postings abroad that taught doubt. A moment in Prague when tanks clattered over the grammar of a people, and something that had been straight in his mind learned to bend. He was KGB by profession and Russian by bone, and he was also, quietly, carefully, something else. A man who decided that telling the truth to a rival could be a higher form of loyalty than repeating a lie to a flag. Copenhagen made it possible. In Denmark, he breathed different air. He saw newspapers that argued without being punished. He listened to music that didn't sound like it had been approved by a committee. He met people who did not speak in slogans. A space opened in him where slogans used to live. That space filled with a decision he did not label treason or courage. He called it honesty. He made contact with Britain not with theater, but with a handshake that lasted long enough to become a habit. MI6 assigned him a case officer whose job was to be quiet and present and unromantic. Together, they learned the trade of talking through a wall without leaving fingerprints on the bricks. NHE rose in the KGB because he was good at being what he was. He spoke languages. He read a room the way a surgeon reads a scan. He possessed the most valuable skill of his generation. He could be in two places at once without moving, because in his mind he held two maps and never let them overlap on the table. Promotions came. London became his territory. When he returned to Moscow between postings, he made himself smaller, because big shapes attract attention. He smiled exactly the amount the building expected. He said the words the building liked to hear. He wrote reports that were correct enough to be believed, and incomplete enough that they did not harm the people he had chosen to protect by telling on his own house. In London, he became more than a source. He became an interpreter of an empire's inner posture. He didn't just pass documents, he drew the posture of a machine, where it was brittle, where it was tired, where it was hungry. He explained doctrine in human terms. He told them how meetings felt, not just what they decided. He was that rarest thing, a spy who gave you context instead of trophies. London learned to build its own maps around his. Then, one year that will later seem inevitable, the air changed. It always does before the facts do. A rival service across the Atlantic suffered an invisible wound. Someone inside them gave the other side a list of names, and on that list there was a thread that led, if you followed it carefully, toward a certain man. Moscow did not say the name out loud. They did not arrest him in a theater of handcuffs. They did something more frightening. They called him home. NHE felt the summons like a hand through a coat. He obeyed, because obedience is part of the disguise, and because disobedience would have been louder than a confession. He flew back to Moscow with a suitcase that told no stories and a face that had practiced looking neutral for years. The city received him with its usual concrete tenderness. He went to his desk. He did the work in front of him. He noticed little changes that meant big things. A different driver at the pool, a new face in a corridor who didn't look at him quite enough, a question in a meeting that felt rehearsed. The KGB did not announce suspicion. Suspicion in that house arrived as absence. A day without a briefing he should have attended, a missing paper he should have been allowed to see, a supervisor who smiled without warmth and said something about review in a voice that held no specific kindness. They moved him sideways into a kind of limbo that had curtains. They invited him to a health retreat outside the city, a dacha where the air smelled of pine and the glassware smelled of laboratories. They asked him questions in rooms that had too many chairs. They offered him tea that tasted like it had thoughts. They watched his eyes after each sip. NIF, you have lived long enough in a building that runs on fear. You know what it means to be treated kindly by men who do not practice kindness. He understood. He did not confess because he had made peace with the fact that he had nothing to confess to their satisfaction. He had chosen his side years ago and had been precise. Precision is slow to implode. It is hard to describe what it feels like to be interrogated by a system that genuinely believes itself to be right. It is not theatrical. It is methodical. It is like standing inside a machine that measures breath, blink, hesitation, and the number of words you use in a sentence you could have said in fewer. He answered as if the subject under discussion was someone else's career. He agreed to rest when they told him to. He let the hours be hours. He made a plan, and the plan was not to become a story that ended at a desk with a photograph and a stamp. Before he had left London, before he had agreed to stand at one end of a rope that reached across a continent, he and the people who paid attention to him had agreed on what to do if the rope started to burn. The plan had a name that sounded domestic, almost ridiculous in the context of the stakes, which is how good plans hide. It was detailed where it needed to be and humble where it could be. It required him to perform a small piece of theater in a city that punished theater. It required other people to move with the right mix of speed and saunter. It required luck to pretend to be routine. NTHE signal would be simple. No spy novels, no chalk marks on lamp posts, no dossiers hidden in bakery bread. Simplicity survives surveillance better than cleverness. He would appear at a specific place, at a specific time, on a specific day of the week. He would carry something ordinary that didn't belong to the city, an object that said, "I know a grocery store you don't," casual and unmistakable. He would walk past a certain landmark at a steady pace, not too slow, not too fast. He would not look up. He would not look back. He would show himself to the watchers he wanted and pretend to ignore the watchers he feared. NHE rehearsed it in his head the way one rehearses a lie that is actually the truth. He chose his day. He dressed like a man with nothing to say. He stepped out into Moscow, which was never as gray as foreign mouths claimed, and joined the city in its business of moving forward without looking down. NTHE first steps felt like when you stand up after a fever. You know you can walk, but your muscles don't trust the floor. He carried the bag that identified him more loudly than a confession. He threaded past kiosks that sold the same magazines they sold last month. A trolley rattled like a cough in a movie. He measured his breathing and made his eyes friendly without being interested. He reached the corner that had been chosen long ago by people who drew lines on maps with the tenderness of cartographers and the coolness of surgeons. Someone brushed past him, which is what strangers do in all cities. A sentence was spoken in his ear that a child could have said without drawing suspicion. He answered with a sentence that every adult in the city could have said without being arrested. That was the beauty of it. Ordinary words made into a key because they had been agreed upon. He did not break stride. Neither did the stranger. Agreement achieved. Theater concluded. Now, work. It is difficult to move in Moscow if you are a foreign intelligence officer charged with doing anything other than being a guest. The city did not welcome improvisation from Westerners. It measured them. It assigned tails with the bored discipline of a bureaucracy that has considered everything before breakfast. The British team that received the signal had practiced their own choreography until muscle memory replaced fear. They knew which cars to use. They knew which drivers had the right wrists for steering past suspicion. They knew where construction narrowed lanes and where the pavement taught speed a lesson. They knew where it was customary to adjust a baby's blanket in the back seat and how long such an adjustment could plausibly take. NTHE meeting place for the next act was not romantic. It was a patch of ground that looked like every other patch of ground, near a road that led away from the rings of the city into the long green that foreigners always underestimated. He was to be on foot. They were to be in cars that belonged to people whose passports made soldiers polite. The plan did not rely on magic. It relied on repetition and on the habit of officialdom to wave through what looked boring. NTHE's hardest part was leaving the building without leaving a crater in the air. He told the guard at the door that he needed to walk. Walking in Moscow was not suspicious. It was what you did when you knew buses were a rumor. He did not take the same route he always took. Taking the same route twice is how you teach someone the size of your footsteps. He looked at no one and at everything. He kept his shoulders honest. He kept his hands free. He left no note. He owed the future less paper than that. NHE felt the watchers long before he saw them. A train tail doesn't stare. It drifts. It becomes background noise with eyes. He looked for the negative space they occupy, the empty seat on a bench that stays empty as if waiting for a ghost, the car that never quite passes you and never quite falls away. He read the reflections in windows, not the windows. He listened for the small cough of a cheap radio trying to keep a frequency. He found none of the obvious cues and refused to congratulate himself. The obvious cues are for stories. The real teams leave nothing for your nerves to hold. NHE crossed a bridge that had learned to like the weight of trucks. He passed a kiosk that sold cigarettes and private regret. He made a left, then a right that could be explained to anyone as the shortest way to where he wasn't going. The city thinned. The air tasted less like hot metal and more like tree. The exit road ahead belonged to officialdom, to dachas and rehearsals, and the country pretending it was a park. Not a lay-by designed by engineers who understood how human bladders work. A car had pulled over. Inside, a family tableau. A child, a small one, asleep in a seat designed to tell soldiers that life was happening in this back seat and not intrigue. A blanket. A mother with the tired competence of someone whose job for the next hour is to manage both an infant and the performance of being ordinary. A father adjusting a strap that did not need adjustment because that is what fathers do when they are pretending to have a reason to be where they are. He approached without approaching. He timed his stride with the ironclad clock of necessity. He passed the car. He did not turn his head. The back door opened the way doors open when a breeze catches them and a human helps. A body changed shape in the back seat. An adult became a leg. A leg became a dent in a cushion. A cavity became a place to be. He folded himself, where luggage normally learns patience. A blanket that had been a child's shield became a man's disguise. A second blanket, thicker, civilian, bought for picnics that never happened, layered the lie with warmth. NTHE car door closed with a softness that belonged to well-maintained engines and to hands that had greased hinges for months for exactly this moment. The driver checked his mirror with the casual concern of a person returning to the road after not much. The mother arranged nothing for a second time. The child did not wake, which is the special grace babies extend to operations designed by adults. The car joined the road with the modest acceleration of a family thinking about lunch. NTHE trunk was not a coffin. It had air because someone had thought about how air works in such spaces. It had a way to signal that did not involve fists on metal. It had, most importantly, boundaries. Surfaces a man could press his back against and convince his nerves that forward motion had a point. He lay still and invented small mathematics. He counted bumps. He translated the bumps into distance. He divided the distance by what he guessed their speed must be. He told himself that progress was being made in numbers, even if he could not see the road sign that would have rewarded his eyes. NTHE convoy, because one car is a story, two cars are a strategy, stretched itself along the route like a sentence with commas. A lead vehicle whose driver knew where the potholes ran under the tarmac. A car with him in it, acting like a family. Another car in reserve, ready to be the decoy if attention became an animal that wanted food. They kept speed that could be explained by law and by caution. They practiced the courtesy of letting local traffic have the lane rather than making an official-looking procession of themselves. The less you look like a plan, the more likely the plan survives a random glance. Behind them, somewhere in the city, Men in a room clicked their tongues and compared notes. They were not stupid. They had suspicions about him that did not need evidence to be sincere. They had their own maps, their own lines, their own cars, their own orders. The difference between the two groups of men was not intelligence, it was timing, and the angle at which luck chooses to bend. NHE lay in the dark and lived inside his breath. He asked himself a question he had rehearsed seeing coming. Had he judged the risk to his family with the same sobriety as he judged the risk to himself? He thought of his wife's face the last time they were in a kitchen together. He thought of his children's shoulders, compact with sleep. He thought of a city that would not be gentle with them just because he had been gentle with it. He accepted the cost without forgiving himself for the invoice. He kept breathing. They reached the first checkpoint the way people reach birthdays, inevitably, and with an expression that says, "This again." The guards were young enough that their uniforms still itched in places they didn't yet know how to scratch politely. Their eyes were familiar with the sight of diplomatic plates. Their training had taught them what to do when those plates stopped where they were supposed to and didn't make jokes. The driver rolled the window down. Documents were presented with the factual grace of paper that has the right creases. A question was asked that referenced a manifest no one in the conversation needed to see. The answer matched the sheet in a folder in a building some kilometers away. No one raised a voice. A barrier lifted because barriers do that when no one makes them nervous. He did not move. Stillness was his best skill now. He looked with his skin instead of his eyes. The way the car's floor hummed differently under acceleration versus idle. The way the driver's foot changed the story the engine told to the spare wheel. The way air found its way from joint to joint in the weather stripping and announced small shifts in elevation. He was not thinking poetically. He was managing a body in a small space with the tools available, and the tools were breath, math, and memory. NTHE Road bent into country that did not accuse. Pines held their own counsel. Villages let the cars pass without becoming proof. The convoy behaved like foreigners who had learned that politeness is not a performance. It is a fuel. They overtook no one they didn't have to. They did not brake like guilty men. They did not accelerate like free ones. They obeyed the rules of being uninteresting. Somewhere behind them, a phone rang in a room where ringing meant a version of panic without witnesses. A roll call. Is he at his desk? Who saw him last? When? Doing what? The answers sounded like excuses, even when they were facts. A supervisor chose to call the next supervisor instead of the one above him because he wanted to be the bringer of a fix rather than a problem. Time leaked. The road received it and did what roads do, turned the leak into distance. NHE thought of the years he had spent carefully telling London what Moscow thought. He had been honest in both directions about the nature of danger. When he said risk, they heard risk. When he said wait, they waited. He trusted them now with the same muscles he used to trust his own instincts. That trust was all that lay between him and a result he had promised himself would not be his. NTHE plan called for pauses that did not look like pauses. Families pull over. Children's blankets need tucking. Adults need to check lists in glove compartments because lists have the power to make you feel like you control something. Each stop was an opportunity to lose timing and to gain plausible reasons to be there. Each stop existed because the road has its own appetite for accidents, and the operation had been built by people who refused to give the road a vote. They reached a larger road and joined a flow that moved like a fat river. Trucks whose drivers knew the police by first name. Buses full of faces that didn't want to be where they were going. Cars with the pride that comes from owning a car anywhere, especially in a country that pretended it didn't care about cars. In that crowd, a pair of embassy vehicles with correct plates blended like a sensible suit at a wedding, visible if you looked for it, invisible if you didn't. NHE exhaled and felt the chest bone thrum of rubber on a surface built by committees. He allowed himself a short memory as medicine, a London morning when he stepped out of a door he had learned by heart and felt the light that only that latitude gives, where the sky looks like a question. He allowed himself the taste of a coffee he once said was too bitter because bitterness had been a choice then. He allowed himself his own name, silently, as if to check it was still attached to the person using it. NHE did not pray. Or if he did, he prayed to competence, to drivers who had practiced this route in their heads, to a station that had prepared for months to appear undecided, to a set of sleights of hand performed not with cards, but with paperwork that could be displayed at a guardhouse without anyone having to invent adjectives. He prayed to the nature of bureaucracies everywhere, that on a good day they prefer not to create problems they would then have to solve. Border country does not announce itself with trumpets. It seeps into the edges of your vision as the signage changes weather, and the faces in uniforms carry a different memory of orders. The plan did not assume the end from the beginning. It assumed friction at exactly the places where friction is born: booths, barriers, bored men who suddenly decide not to be bored, and random machines that blink red instead of green, because electricity is a language with a sense of humor. They made the last fuel stop permitted by the choreography. Fuel stops are where lungs get their second wind, and where the person in the trunk has to accept that the outside world still exists, measured in voices, doors, the scraping sound of a nozzle, the exact number of seconds a receipt takes to print. He imagined the pump's rhythm because he could not hear it. He timed how long it would take to walk around the car twice. He placed that number beside another number. How long it took in rehearsals back in London to undo a catch quietly and redo it with the same quiet. He decided the math favored him. NTHE driver returned. The car told him they were moving again by telling his shoulder what gravity wanted from it. The convoy formed up like a thought being finished. The road narrowed. The signs announced what the next hour would be: inspection lanes, currencies of attention, stamps, the international art of shrugging. Ahead lay a barrier, and, beyond it, a line of paint on the ground that meant more to him than any painting he had ever stood in front of. In a building with views of this barrier, people whose job was to turn suspect motion into paperwork prepared for a shift change. They checked watches they did not own, but were responsible for keeping exact. They poured tea into mugs that knew everyone's lip. They glanced at lists that contained all the names that were considered important at that hour, and found none of the names in their own heads. They were doing their jobs. They were not villains. They were the friction he would have to survive. NTHE car rolled toward the gate with the tolerant weariness of a machine that had been through this before. The driver held his mouth in the neutral line diplomats learn, the expression that says, "I respect you," and also says, "We both know this is a process, not a debate." The guard asked for papers and received them neatly. He glanced at the back seat and saw exactly what he expected to see: domesticity. He glanced at the trunk, not as accusation, but as reflex, the way a person glances at a closed book and guesses its chapters. There was a protocol for opening that book. There were also protocols about who wrote the protocols and which protocols outranked others depending on the colors on the plates. Diplomatic immunity is not magic. It is an agreement to be civilized even when you are tempted not to be. Today, civilization decided to be civil. NTHE barrier, raised with the melancholy grace that barriers have when they know their work is necessary but not noble. The car moved through. The second car moved through. The reserve car brought up the memory of a parade and erased it with its restraint. NHE felt it not as victory, but as subtraction, the removal of a future in which he had to invent pain management strategies for rooms that chase sleep away. He did not allow himself sentiment, he allowed himself air. They crossed into a different jurisdiction, a different habit of questions, a different set of files that did not contain his birth certificate. The road widened, as if borders are bad at narrowing things. Trees did not change. They have no use for politics. The car allowed itself a modest increase in speed, the way a human body lengthens its stride when a hill becomes a slope. NHE did not sit up. He did not ask. He did not need to. He knew the angle of acceleration that belongs to relief. He counted to a number he had chosen years ago, in a room where a poster reminded people to wash their hands. When he reached that number, he He let his palm touch the inner wall once, a thank you he did not say out loud. The wall did not answer, which is what you want from walls. Ahead lay more road, and the work of getting to a city that had promised him a bed and a name he could use without flinching. Behind lay a city that had taught him how to be two people and was now, reluctantly, allowing him to be one. Between them lay the space where luck shakes hands with planning. This is where we will pause. In motion, in darkness that is also protection, in a car that smells faintly of upholstery and baby powder, with a man who has decided that history belongs to those who outlast the moment that wants to swallow them. In the next part, we will open the road completely. The boundary where questions multiply, the small human gestures that protect large human stakes, and the exact minute when a man who had been a ghost in London emerged into daylight as himself. NTHE Trunk was a small country with its own weather. He lay in it and made a treaty with the darkness. I will stay quiet if you will stay kind. The car hummed the way a human throat hums when it is trying not to be afraid. Above him, voices performed ordinariness. A mother invented the gentle complaints of a child who did not exist. A father rehearsed his patience with a seatbelt. The baby slept like luck, warm and persuasive. He counted the seconds between gear changes and told himself the story that distance was winning. NTHE First Foreign Guard wore his uniform like he had done a shift in it yesterday and would do another tomorrow. His eyes were trained to see impatience more than guilt. He asked the usual questions and got the usual answers, and every one of those answers landed with the thud of something that had been prepared but not polished. That's what made them good. The worst lie is the one that looks like a lie walking to work in a new suit. These looked like slightly wrinkled truth. NTHE barrier rose. The car rolled. He didn't move. He didn't cheer in his own head. He listened to the sound a road makes when it stops negotiating with the past and starts negotiating with the future. It changed by a fraction, enough for a man who had been taught to hear fractions. The tires found a different rhythm in the seams. The engine stretched its vowels. The driver let a breath go he had been pretending he wasn't holding. History for one full second forgot to be dramatic. They drove on. A mile, then another mile, then a cluster of them, and then a number of miles that he decided not to count, because counting can turn into guilt when something interrupts your arithmetic. The child shifted and murmured in the seat above him. Real child, real breath, and the small sound did more for his nerves than any speech a minister could have given. The world was operating under its own laws. Even while rooms elsewhere checked empty chairs, this car obeyed the gravity of a family. He respected that gravity as if it were holy. Somewhere behind them, phones were ringing in a building that knew how to ring phones without swearing it was an emergency. A supervisor found the line on a calendar that said he had been scheduled here, not there. A driver remembered a pause that had seemed like nothing. A name that had been spoken lightly all year was spoken differently now, as if the mouth that said it tasted iron. The order went out to check roads, to ask questions with smiles, to pretend to be relaxed while inventorying suspicion. The order found men who were very good at pretending. The order, because of the way minutes work, arrived slightly late. NTHE convoy kept time like a metronome. A straight road, a modest curve, a polite overtake. A wave to a trucker, because the trucker had the weight and deserved the lane. No one practiced heroism, they practiced reliability. In the trunk, he matched his breath to the car's vibration and let the engine give him his tempo. He pictured a meeting years ago in a London room with thin carpet, where a map had sat on a table and someone had traced this route with a finger, as if the road would feel encouraged. He whispered his one superstition. Stay ordinary. He meant the car. He meant the guards. He meant the world. They reached the second checkpoint, the one everyone had quietly dreaded, because the men here had a reputation for reading between lines. The car slowed. The barrier loomed like a thought no one wanted to have. The driver took his papers in 2 fingers and offered them with a posture that said he had no new ideas. The guard leaned in. He glanced at the sleeping child and softened by a millimeter, because even men who have memorized the stern parts of a manual are still people who were children once. He asked where they were headed. The driver told him a city that made sense. He asked if they would be staying the night. The driver said, "If the child allows it." A second of shared amusement did what it always does between adults doing a job. It shaved a corner off a rectangle. The guard walked around to the back. This was the moment the plan had respected from the beginning. The trunk might be tapped, or opened, or ignored. There was a diplomatic protocol, yes, but protocols are sometimes merely braver ways of saying maybe. The guard laid a palm on the lid. He pressed down in the universal gesture of a man checking that metal exists. The lid did what lids do. It didn't complain. He did not ask for it to be opened. Not today. Not this car. Not this guard. He returned to the driver's window, wrote something onto a clipboard that would later be unreadable even to him, and lifted his chin to the barrier operator. The barrier rose, slow, ceremonial, bored. The car moved. He stayed still. He allowed himself to picture a door in a city he loved. NTHE convoy shed its caution by a single degree and kept going. In his small country in the trunk, he did 2 things he had promised himself to postpone until the last border was behind them. He let himself remember the exact day in Copenhagen when he decided to step across a line inside himself. And he allowed himself to miss his family so hard that it shook him. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not grant any either. He decided to survive so that the apologies would someday have meaning. NTHE last checkpoint arrived not with trumpets, but with bureaucracy. A line of cars. A lane that became 3 lanes that became 1 again. Stanchions. A large clock that had lost 2 minutes last winter and never found them. Guards with morning on their breath and afternoon in their eyes. The car pulled forward inch by inch as papers were checked, and stamps met ink, and ink met paper, and paper met hands, and hands met the impulse to find a reason to say no. The driver let other cars cut in when it made him look humane. He did not insist. He stayed in character as a man who had time. There is a thing that happens at borders when everyone decides to be practical. It is not grace, exactly. It is a truce. The guard who must be thorough meets the traveler who must be patient, and between them they construct a hallway out of procedures and walk down it together, without remarking that either of them could make the hallway collapse. That is how most days pass, people choosing not to test the architecture. Today, the architecture held. The last barrier lifted. The car crossed. The tires changed their song by a note. He put his palm against the inner wall again, once, brief, like touching a friend's sleeve. They drove deep enough into safer country for the convoy to relax into an idea it had been carrying all morning, that there would be a moment when a man could unfold. The driver took a road that ran beside trees that seemed older than the arguments of governments. They turned off onto a smaller road that had been scouted the way you scout a friend's porch for loose boards. They eased to a stop under a set of pines that had hosted other quiet miracles in other years. The mother reached back and straightened the blanket. The door clicked. The trunk caught light. NHE did not spring up like a hero in a stage play. He sat up slowly because his body had ideas about gravity that needed recalibration. He blinked at a sky that looked exactly like a sky. He saw faces that were trying not to be proud. He took a breath that wasn't measured by anyone else's plans. He was helped out by hands that were professional in the way good hands are, strong, unflustered, unsentimental, present. He stood. He swayed. He smiled because that was what his mouth decided to do while his eyes were still negotiating with daylight. They did not speak much. He drank water. He thanked them in the small, specific way a person thanks someone who has carried one end of a stretcher for miles. They closed the trunk. They folded blankets. They became, to any camera that did not exist, a family taking a break by some trees on a day that was unremarkable. Then they got back in the cars and joined the world again, this time toward a capital whose buildings would not recognize his face as an enemy's. In the city, a safe house waited, a space that had learned never to look like a solution. Heavy curtains, because heavy curtains make neighbors uninterested. A table with a bowl on it, because bowls are what people put on tables when they are pretending nothing is happening. A kettle. A sofa. A room whose function was secrecy but whose design was gentleness. He sat. He removed his shoes because he had grown up in a culture that considered floors to be part of the story. He put his feet flat on something that wasn't moving and felt 30 hours climb down off his spine. NHE began to speak, not as a torrent, as a ledger. Names, schedules, priorities. The tone of a meeting that seemed normal at the time but will be important in 3 months. Who had fallen, where the building's ambitions were pointing, the places where fear had made men loyal beyond reason, the places where boredom had made men careless. He spoke in sentences that were engineered to carry both facts and weight. His listeners did what the best listeners do. They did not interrupt cleverness into the room. They let the man who had earned the chair set the pace. NTHE debrief began with surface and moved, over hours and then days, beneath. The gifts were not just documents he had carried in his head. The gift was perspective. What did they fear? What did they misunderstand about the West that could be used to make the world safer rather than more dangerous? Where did paranoia turn doctrine into ritual? Where did ritual soften into opportunity? He answered in the only way that made sense after a life like his. Carefully. There was a call to London that contained no adjectives and a plane that contained no curiosity. He arrived to a country that already knew him and pretended it didn't, which is the politest form of welcome a secret world provides. A car drove him to a house that might have belonged to a widowed aunt. There were hedges trimmed by someone who understood the concept of dignity. The front step had been swept by a broom that had never been taught espionage. He crossed the threshold, and if there had been an audience, the audience would have clapped. But there was no audience, only people who had work to do and a kettle to boil. NHE met a new team whose job was to make the rest of his life possible. They were not glamorous. A doctor who listened to lungs like they were confessions. A psychologist who asked about dreams without declaring herself the interpreter of them. A practical officer who explained how pension systems work when your last employer cannot be named. A quiet man who had an answer for the question he had not stopped asking himself in the dark. His family. The answer was honest and hard. His wife and children were still in a city that would not consider generosity to be the proper response to his decision. There would be attempts, letters disguised as bureaucratic flickers, channels to try, pressure to apply or to resist, and time to cross like a river in winter. The team told the truth, because lies are a second drowning. NHE began his new job, memory. For weeks that became months, he built a map in other people's notebooks. He designed lists that would let strangers who had not met the KGB understand it as a living thing, rather than a monster under a bed. He talked about the campaign that had taught Moscow to search for signs of a Western first strike in clouds and calendars. He explained why certain exercises conducted in November had almost convinced men with keys that the apocalypse was being rehearsed with real bullets. He pointed to the hinge moments where he believed caution had been the only useful bravery. His briefings didn't sound like novels. They sounded like weather reports for a climate people had assumed would never change. NTHE consequences across the river were immediate and predictable. Files were opened that were all edges. Investigators followed the wake he had left, even though he had tried not to leave one. Colleagues were summoned into rooms that smelled of ashtrays and light bulbs. His name became a shape that made other names afraid to stand too close. A court in Moscow changed a legal category into a moral verdict and declared him something less than what he had always known himself to be. The sentence was written on paper, and the paper was filed, and the file was placed in a cabinet that had so many metal scars from so many tragedies that it no longer noticed new ones. The people who had helped him are the part of the story that never wants a headline. A driver who had learned to roll up to a barrier at precisely the speed that makes a guard think of his lunch instead of his duty. A case officer who could sit in silence without making silence feel like pressure. A desk officer who could compose a cable that told you what had happened and what should happen next without wasting a syllable you might need someday. A diplomat who knew when to use a smile and when to be a piece of furniture. The baby who slept. The mother who made sleep look credible. The father who was not a father but understood the script fathers carry. They scattered back to their ordinary desks, which is where metals live if they are honest. NHE learned England. Not the romantic England of postcards, but the domestic one. Which bus routes are reliable in the rain? How to greet a neighbor's dog without promising too much? Which grocery stores have the good apples? Which quiet lanes on the edge of a park belong to runners before 8 a.m.? Which pubs mind their own business? He learned the new gravity of a name that was his and only his. He allowed himself to become a man who could be recognized in a bakery because the person behind the till had seen him before buying milk, not because that person read files for a living. When he was asked to speak in rooms where the chairs had been arranged with care, he did not tell stories that worshipped his own nerve. He told stories that honored procedure. He explained how thoughtfulness can be a weapon, how patience can be a lever, how ordinary objects, shopping bags, blankets, a list of questions recited without flourish, can move continents when everyone involved agrees to stop showing off. He spoke about fear as something you carry without letting it leak onto the floor. He declined to call himself brave. He called himself lucky and then described the labor that makes luck plausible. And then there were letters. The kind that travel slowly, not because of distance, but because of caution. They arrived with the politeness of strangers who know your address from a friend. They contained domestic news written in code that wasn't code. How the snow fell this year in a city that thinks it owns snow. How a child grew an inch. How a school changed a teacher. How a neighbor asked after you without meaning the question to become a report. He read them sitting at a table where sunlight had decided to make a shape across wood. He answered carefully, which is to say warmly without being careless. He asked about health. He did not ask about surveillance. He wrote about the taste of bread where he was, how different flour makes different crumbs. He included in every letter the same sentence in different clothing. I am here, years turned, the world bent and then unbent and then bent again. The city he had left learned to carry new names for old problems. Walls that had been good at being walls discovered they were tired. Borders discovered they had memories. The file with his sentence in it lost its sharp corners and gained coffee stains. He grew older in a country that had learned to pronounce his last name without a question mark. He made friends who had never met the man he once was and did not need to. He made a small life that was not small at all. A chair that knew his weight, a window that knew how to frame a sky, a rhythm to days that did not depend on alarms. Once, years after the trunk and the road and the barrier, he stood at the back of a lecture hall while a young officer explained to younger officers how to recognize when a simple plan was better than a clever one. The slide on the wall contained an illustration of a car, a border, a dotted line. The younger officer used phrases he had invented in a room with a kettle. Stay ordinary, borrow plausibility, never let the plan become the point. He did not interrupt. He did not identify himself. He let the words do their work, wearing the voice of someone else. He smiled the smile of a man who has seen language outlive him. At home, he kept a modest drawer in which he placed 5 objects that belonged to the long day when he moved from being a suspicion in one capital to a citizen in another. The objects were not theatrical. A pen with a nick. A map folded so precisely it felt like a compress. A receipt for petrol that had gotten damp and learned to curl. A spare strap for a child's seat that had never been used. A small square of blanket. He did not take them out often. When he did, he held them with the respect one gives to instruments that have saved a life. He never stopped being watchful. You don't unlearn that. He walked to the store and counted the exits without judging himself for it. He sat in a cafe and chose a seat with a view of the door while laughing at a joke that deserved a laugh. He read the newspaper with the skepticism of a man who has watched headlines arrive at desks and be sanded into paragraphs. He kept his habits, even while his needs changed. The habits kept him honest. The country allowed him to be ordinary in public and private in private. That is a luxury no uniform knows how to issue. And if you are looking for drama, it is there. It lives in the minute when a guard's hand rested on a trunk and decided not to insist on becoming history. It lives in the breath the driver took between one sentence and the next. It lives in the competent movements of a mother straightening a blanket. It lives in the silence he kept while lying with his face 6 inches from a toolkit. It lives in the decision months earlier to make the signal simple enough to survive a bad day. But if you are looking for meaning, it is quieter. It lives in the way people agreed to be excellent at small things for a long time without asking for applause. Nay, as for the city you left, it had its own quiet meaning. There were men in that building who knew they were playing a game that could not be won by winning. There were others who knew only that their job was to hold the line on a piece of paper and hope that the line outlasted the pen. Some had misgivings and called them loyalty. Some had certainties and called them fear. They were not cartoons. They were people inside a machine that punished doubt and rewarded velocity. He had not escaped villains. He had escaped a system of incentives. He was old enough to tell the difference. One late afternoon, in a small park off a small street, he sat on a bench and watched 2 children race a paper boat along a gutter after rain. They whooped at speed and groaned at eddies and shouted advice to a vessel that obeyed only physics. An older woman passed and told them to mind their feet, and they nodded at the precise degree of respect that children who mean to keep playing learn to calibrate. He thought about the boat, a fragile thing traveling through a world full of drains. He thought about all the drains he had avoided. He thought about the hands that had lifted him over grates. NHE did not spend his days and nights reliving the trunk. He allowed it a room in his house, not the whole house. He cooked, he washed dishes, he was bad at gardening, and believed weeds were the bravest plants. He watched a football match and learned the names of people young enough to be his grandchildren, but famous enough to be everyone's. He went to a concert where a piece of music he had heard in a Copenhagen flat decades ago finally made him cry. He slept. He woke. He watered a fern, and it forgave him. And in the end, the file that had begun the first day of this story, the one that smelled like paper and patience in a brick building by the river, acquired a last page. It did not contain triumph. It contained, thanks to an unnamed driver, appreciation for a mother and a child who had performed a small miracle without noticing, a line for a mechanic who had prepared a trunk that behaved exactly like a trunk should, a paycheck that went out monthly to a man who now taught young officers how to think without noise, and a single sentence that could be read aloud on days when someone in a meeting forgot what the work was for. Small human gestures, large human stakes. Oleg Gordievsky stepped into daylight that day not as a symbol, but as a person. The symbol came later, when his story found air and readers. He had not asked to be a symbol. He had asked to be honest, and then to survive the honesty. He did both. He did them because other people did their part precisely. History did the rest, slowly at first, then all at once. And if you want to pin the ending to a single image, use this one. A car door closing with the soft, domestic sound of a door that has closed 10,000 times and will close 10,000 more. And inside, a man folding himself into a shape that fits a plan. While outside a child sleeps, a mother smiles at nothing in particular. A driver checks his mirror, and a barrier rises without ambition. Not a chase. Not a gun. Just the quiet discipline of people who refuse to let a life be decided by someone else's performance. NHE did not get everything he deserved. No one does. But he got what mattered. A future he could walk into upright, a voice he could use without translation, and mornings uncomplicated by the fear that a knock on the door had become a verdict. London gained a ghost and then gave him a name. Moscow lost a servant and gained a lesson. The rest of us got a story that teaches exactly what you hope it teaches, that calm under pressure is not a pose. It is a craft, that ordinary objects can be extraordinary tools, and that the difference between catastrophe and continuity is often a handful of people agreeing, in secret and without ceremony, to get the small things exactly right. NTHE, small human gestures protected the large human stakes. And a man who had been a ghost emerged into daylight as himself, walked into a house where the kettle knew his name, and sat down, at last, on a chair that had been waiting specifically for him.